Hollis Vance had told herself at 58, after 31 years of giving Sentinel Pacific Capital the best hours of her life, that the worst part of her career was already behind her. She was wrong. On a Thursday morning in late September, the woman she had personally hired out of business school 14 years earlier sat across from her in a glass-walled conference room and explained, in the gentle voice people use when they have decided in advance not to feel anything, that the firm was restructuring its senior advisor positions, and that Hollis's would not be among the ones that survived. There was a banker's box waiting by the elevator when she came out. Her photograph of her father standing beside the cabin in Idaho. Her mother's framed Audubon print from 1976. A coffee mug from Whistler. A pen her daughter had given her at college graduation. 26 years of work compressed into the space of 9 inches by 12. Security walked her down. They were polite. The younger one held the door of her own car for her in the parking garage. By noon, she was sitting in the driver's seat of a Toyota Highlander she had owned for 11 years, with a box on the passenger seat and her phone face down on her thigh, looking through the windshield at a concrete wall in downtown Seattle, and she could not for the life of her think of where to drive. She drove east. She did not call her brother. She did not call her daughter, Magnolia, who was finishing her residency in Portland and who would have wanted to be helpful in a way Hollis could not bear that day. She did not call anyone. She drove east on Interstate 90 with a box on the passenger seat and a quarter tank of gas, and she drove past Snoqualmie and past Ellensburg and past the wind farms of Vantage. Somewhere outside Spokane, on a stretch of empty highway that smelled of pine resin and wheat dust, she remembered the cabin. What Hollis did not know yet, as the September lights slanted across the Idaho panhandle and the road narrowed and the ponderosas closed in on either side, was that the cabin she was driving toward had been waiting for her for 9 years. She did not know that her father had spent the last 3 decades of his life building something inside it. She did not know that the man who had been her father's closest friend had been driving up to the cabin every Tuesday morning since the funeral to keep the wood stove dry and the kettle warm. And she did not know that on the afternoon she finally turned the key for the first time, the coffee in the percolator on the cast iron stove would still be warm. If this story is already pulling at something in you, hit the like button and subscribe to Left Behind, and drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching from. She had almost nothing left. No one knew what was waiting. Keep watching. Hollis Vance had been born in 1968 in a small frame house on a ridge above the Kootenai River, 3 miles outside Bonners Ferry, Idaho, in the long northern panhandle of the state where the highway runs out and the maps go quiet. Her mother, Adelaide Holcomb Vance, had been a hydrologist with the U.S. Geological Survey. Her father, Whitman Vance, had been a Forest Service surveyor who taught himself geology in the evenings and kept a small leather notebook in the breast pocket of his shirt for 41 years. They had been married 8 years when her mother went out alone on a research run on the river in May of 1979 and did not come back. Hollis had been 11. Her brother Dax had been 7. What her father did in the months after her mother's disappearance, Hollis learned much later from neighbors and from her grandmother, was move the children to a smaller house in Coeur d'Alene that was closer to a school and a hospital and the people who could help him raise them, and then drive back to the cabin on the ridge every weekend by himself for the next 40 years. He never spoke about her mother in her presence. He never put her photograph back on the wall. He walked Hollis to school in the morning and made her oatmeal with brown sugar and read to her at night from a book of John Muir essays that had belonged to her mother. Whatever he was carrying about Adelaide Holcomb Vance, he kept it in a locked drawer in his own chest where his daughter could not see it. She left for college at 18. She left for Seattle at 22. She married a man named Edmund at 26 and divorced him at 38, and she raised Magnolia alone, and she rose at Sentinel Pacific from analyst to associate to senior advisor to managing director. Along the way, she stopped going home to Idaho more than once a year, and after her father retired and moved back permanently to the cabin in 2009, she stopped going home at all. She told herself it was distance. She told herself her father liked his solitude. She told herself the cabin was just a cabin, the way her brother told her it was just a cabin, and the way her brother's wife told her it was just a cabin, and the way her own ex-husband had once told her, in the year before he left her, that her people were strange and quiet and a little obsessed with a piece of dirt none of them had ever made any money from. Whitman Vance had died on a Tuesday morning in October of 2017. He had been 79. He had gone to bed the night before in apparently good health and had not gotten up in the morning. There had been no warning. There had been no chance to say anything that had not already been said. Hollis had flown in. She had stayed 3 days. She had cleaned out his cupboards and packed the perishables into a cooler, and she had arranged for a man named Cassius Birch, her father's oldest friend, whom she vaguely remembered from her childhood as a tall, quiet man who sometimes came to dinner, to keep an eye on the place until she could come back. She had not come back. Her brother had come back. Dax had come back twice. He had come back the year after the funeral with a contractor and an appraiser and the particular polite tone of voice he used when he wanted something. He had called Hollis from the porch of the cabin and told her in his slow, careful way that the place was rotting from the inside, that the foundation was shot, that the roof was going to need $40,000 in work, and that the most loving thing they could do for their father's memory was to sell the parcel to a developer he knew in Sandpoint who would take it off their hands for $110,000 and use the land as a hunting lease. Hollis had said no. She had said no without being able to explain why. She had said no the way you say no to a sibling who has been making subtle suggestions about something that is not there since you were both children, and she had hung up the phone and gone back to her quarterly review and not thought about the cabin again for 9 months. Dax had called again. By 2021, he had stopped calling and started sending her dry little texts twice a year that always asked the same question in slightly different language. Are you doing anything with Dad's place yet? The land just sitting there is a waste hole. The land just sitting there. She crossed the Idaho line at 4 in the afternoon. The light was already gold along the tops of the larches. She drove through Coeur d'Alene without stopping. She drove north on Highway 95 through Sandpoint and on toward Bonner's Ferry, and the road narrowed, and the river ran alongside it, and the mountain stood up on the eastern side of the valley like the wall of a house she had not been inside in a long time. She had not eaten since the conference room. She did not feel hungry. She was driving on a tide she did not know the name of, and she did not stop to question it, because she had nothing to drive toward in any other direction. At Bonner's Ferry, she turned east on a county road she had not driven in 11 years. The pavement gave out at 3 miles. The gravel road climbed for another 2 through stands of larch and ponderosa. She passed the rusted gate that marked the start of her father's parcel, a gate Cassius Birch had built in 1989 to keep hunters from cutting the road at night. And she put the Highlander in a low gear, and she drove the last half-mile up a track the September rains had not yet rutted, but were getting ready to. The cabin came into view at 6:12 in the evening, and it was bigger than she remembered. She had remembered a small dark structure with a tin chimney in the woods. She was looking at a long, low, hand-built house of cedar and stone, with a stone chimney 3 feet square at the gable end, a covered porch the length of the south face, and a roof of standing seam steel that did not look like it had been laid down in 1972, even though she knew that her father and his friend had laid the original roof down in exactly that year. Someone had replaced the roof recently. Someone had stained the cedar in the last 2 seasons. Someone had been keeping this place. She killed the engine. She sat in the cab for a long minute in the silence the engine left behind, and she listened to the wind moving through the larches, and she watched a single column of pale, gray smoke rise from the stone chimney and disappear into the gold air above the trees. The chimney was smoking. Hollis Vance sat in her car in the driveway of her dead father's cabin and watched the smoke, and she felt the particular cold drop a person feels when the world has done something that does not fit any of the categories the person has been using to organize the world. And she said out loud to no one, "Dad." She got out of the car. She left the box on the passenger seat. She walked up the slate path her father had laid in 1971. She remembered the day he laid it. She had been 3 years old. He had let her press her palm into the wet mortar of the second-to-last stone, and she stepped up onto the porch, and she stopped at the front door because she did not have a key. That was not true. She did have a key. She stood on the porch in the gold September light and reached into the zip pocket of her wallet, the small one she had stopped using years ago for anything except a single house key Cassius Birch had pressed in her hand at the lawyer's office in Coeur d'Alene 3 days after her father's funeral. He had given it to her in a small white envelope with her name written on the outside in her father's tight-kneed hand, and inside the envelope had been the key and a slip of paper with 2 sentences in the same hand. "The cabin is yours. There is something in it you should see when you are ready." She had read the note twice, sitting in a vinyl chair in the lawyer's reception area, and she had folded it and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the inner pocket of her purse, and she had forgotten about it the way grieving people forget about things their dead parents have asked them to do, because to do them would require feeling something they cannot afford to feel yet. She had transferred the key to her wallet at some point in the years afterward when she had switch purses, and she had carried it on her person every day for 9 years without thinking about it, the way her grandmother had carried a thimble in her apron pocket every day for 64 years. She held the key in her right hand. She put it in the lock. It turned without resistance. The door opened. The smell came out around her first. Cedar smoke and pine sap and coffee. Coffee. Fresh coffee. The kind of coffee that has been brewed in the last hour. Hollis stood in the doorway with her hand still on the latch and let the smell come over her, and her chest did something complicated that she did not have a word for. She stepped inside. The cabin was warm. A fire was burning low in the stone fireplace at the far end of the great room, banked carefully with a screen in front of it, the way a person banks a fire when they intend to come back to it. A kettle was on the cast iron cook stove in the kitchen alcove. The kettle was off the burner but still hot to the eye. There was a faint thread of steam rising from the spout, just visible against the pine paneling behind the stove. On the wooden counter beside the stove, there was an enameled blue percolator, the kind her father had used her whole life. Beside it, a chipped white mug. The mug was half full. The coffee in the mug was still steaming. Hollis put her hand against the doorframe to steady herself. There was a notepad on the kitchen table. The top sheet had a single line of handwriting in pencil, in a hand she did not recognize. "Welcome home, Hollis. CB." She stood there for a long time. She did not move. She did not call out. She did not look around the room for whoever had written the note. The wind moved through the larches outside. A log shifted in the fireplace. The cabin had been waiting, and now she was inside it, and someone had left coffee on the stove for her, and she did not know yet whether to feel grief or fear or something older than both. The only thought in her head, clear as the ridge above the river, was that her father had told someone she was coming 9 years before she had known herself. She did not call out. Some part of her, the part that had spent 31 years reading rooms before she walked into them, understood that whoever had built this fire and put on this coffee was not in the cabin at this moment. The note said welcome. The note did not say I am here. She set her purse on the bench by the door. She took off her city coat and hung it on a peg her father had carved out of an antler in 1981. She walked across the great room slowly, the way you walk across a room you remember from a dream, and she stood in front of the cook stove and put her hand near the mug without touching it, and she felt the heat of the coffee come up against her palm. The cabin had been kept. That was the first thing she understood before any of the others. The pine floor was clean. The windows were clean. The Hudson Bay blanket on the back of the long pine bench had been beaten and folded. There was kindling in the wood box, split fine, the way her father had taught her to split it when she was 9 years old. There was a kerosene lamp on the side table, the chimney polished, the wick trimmed. There were dry boots by the door, not her father's boots. A smaller pair, scuffed, well-oiled, the leather seasoned by years of use. She walked the perimeter of the great room. She touched the back of the rocking chair where her father had sat every evening of every summer of her childhood, reading to her out of a book of John Muir essays. She touched the spine of the book itself, still on the side table where he had left it. The same book, the same edition, the dust jacket worn through at the corners. She picked it up. There was a slip of paper marking a page. She opened the book to the marker and saw a single sentence underlined in pencil, in a hand she did not recognize at first, and then did. It was her father's hand, but older, the hand of a man who had developed a tremor in his last years. "The mountains are calling, and I must go." The marker itself was a strip of birch bark with a date written on it in pencil. October 14th, 2017. He had been reading this sentence the night he died. Hollis sat down on the bench with the book in her lap, and she did not move for several minutes. The fire shifted in the grate. The wind moved through the larches. Somewhere in the trees behind the cabin, a great horned owl called once and was answered by another farther up the ridge. She did not weep. She had learned in a glass-walled conference room 9 hours earlier that she would not weep on demand for a long time. She sat with the book and the birch bark marker and the sentence her father had been reading the night he stopped, and she let the cabin hold her in a way nothing in her life in Seattle had been built to hold her. She heard the truck before she saw it. It was an old gasoline engine, the slow chug of a flathead 6, coming up the gravel track the way a vehicle comes up a track that has been climbed by the same driver for a long time. Hollis closed the book and sat on the bench beside her. She stood. She did not feel afraid. She felt the way a person feels when something that has been hidden from them is about to become visible, and she walked to the front door and opened it and stepped onto the porch in time to see a 1962 Ford F-100 pickup, the original mineral blue paint long faded to the color of winter sky, come around the last bend and stop at the edge of the slate path. The man who got out was tall and stooped at the shoulders the way tall men who have lived through Idaho winters get stooped, and his hair was white, and his hands were the size of dinner plates. He was wearing a green canvas work coat and a wool watch cap and a pair of leather boots that matched the smaller pair by the door. He shut the truck door without slamming it. He looked up at her on the porch. He did not smile. He did not wave. He stood at the edge of the path the way a man stands at the edge of someone else's property when he is not sure yet whether he has been invited. "You're early," he said. "I told your father you wouldn't come for another month, maybe 2. He said no. She'll come when the floor falls out from under her, and that'll be sooner than you think." Hollis did not move. "Cassius Birch." "Yes, ma'am. You've been keeping the cabin. Tuesdays and Saturdays. Since the funeral. Your father asked me to. Before the funeral, I should say. 3 years before." "Why?" "Because he asked me to." "That's not what I'm asking." Cassius Birch took his cap off his head and held it in both hands in front of him, the way men of his generation hold their hats when something is about to be said that requires both hands to be holding something. He looked at her for a long moment with eyes that were the color of weak tea. "He asked me to keep it warm. He said when she comes, she's going to come tired, and she's going to come at the end of something, and I want her to walk into a warm house with a fire in the grate and coffee on the stove, the same way her mother used to come home to one." That's what he said, word for word. October of 2014. We were standing right where you're standing. "My mother." "Yes, ma'am." He never talked about my mother. He talked about her every Tuesday for 40 years, ma'am. He just didn't talk about her in front of you. Hollis put her hand on the porch rail. The cedar was cold. The light was almost gone now. Only a thin band of gold left along the western ridge, and the cabin behind her was a square of warm yellow against the gathering dark. "Mr. Birch, Cassius is fine. What is in this cabin?" He did not answer right away. He looked past her at the open door of the cabin and the firelight inside and the chimney, smoke rising into the cold sky, and his face did a thing she would not have a word for until much later, when she would describe it to her daughter as the face a man makes when he has been carrying something for a long time and has just been asked, finally, by the person it belongs to set it down. "Your father's life," he said. "If this story has found its way to you, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story from Left Behind. Your support is what keeps these stories coming, and there are so many more waiting to be told." He came inside. He took off his boots at the door without being asked. He poured himself a cup of coffee from the percolator and topped off her mug without asking and sat down across from her at the pine table. And he set his hat on the bench beside him and folded his hands on the table, and he began at the beginning because she had asked and because the asking had taken 9 years. Whitman Vance had not been a Forest Service surveyor who taught himself geology in the evenings. Whitman Vance had been a Forest Service surveyor who had been, in his quiet, careful, private way, one of the more accomplished amateur mineralogists in the Northern Rockies. He had begun walking the ridge above the Kootenai River in 1971, the year he and Adelaide bought the parcel. He had been 28 years old. He had found, in his second summer of walking, a vein of quartz on the backside of the ridge that contained traces of something that did not look like quartz. He had brought a sample home in a coffee can. He had identified it himself, sitting at the kitchen table, working through a mineralogy textbook he had ordered from a press in Boulder, Colorado. It was silver, a complex silver-bearing tetrahedrite, not pure enough or large enough to be commercially mined in any conventional sense, but rich enough that a careful person working alone with a small claim could, over the course of a working lifetime, take out of it a quiet and considerable amount of metal. Hollis put her coffee cup down. Cassius nodded. He had expected the cup to come down. He filed the claim in 1972, he said. Federal mining claim, 20 acres, the back portion of the parcel up against the National Forest line. He filed it under a holding company he set up the same year. He used a lawyer in Spokane your mother went to high school with. He paid the annual maintenance on it every August for 45 years. He never told anyone except your mother and me. Your mother helped him work it from 1972 until 1979. Until she died. Until she went into the river. Yes. You don't say died. No, ma'am. She looked at him across the table. What does that mean, Mr. Birch? That's a longer story than tonight. That's a story your father wrote down and locked up in this cabin 9 years ago, and he asked me to make sure you read it before I told you any of it in my own words. He was particular about that. He wanted you to read it from him. Where did he lock it up? Cassius Birch finished his coffee. He set the mug down carefully. He looked across the table at the woman his oldest friend had been talking about every Tuesday for 9 years, the daughter who had not come, the daughter who would come when the floor fell out from under her, and he stood up and walked to the stone fireplace and laid his hand against the third stone up from the hearth on the left side of the chimney, and he pressed. The stone moved. It came out of the wall on a small set of pivots her father had cut into the limestone in the autumn of 2008, set there with the care of a man who had spent 40 years measuring the earth and understood what it would and would not tolerate. Behind the stone was a recess about the size of a milk crate, dry, lined with cedar, and inside the recess was a heavy metal cash box the color of dried blood and a leather portfolio tied with a strip of wax cotton cord. Cassius did not touch the box. He lifted the portfolio out and brought it to the table and set it in front of her and went back to the fireplace and slid the stone back into place. And he did it all without speaking, the way a man does the steps of a thing he has been rehearsing for 9 years. He wrote it in 2014, he said. He updated it every September. The last entry is from September of 2017, 3 weeks before he died. I have not read a single page of it. He told me not to. I never did. Hollis put her hands on the leather. The cord was old, but not cracked. She untied it. She opened the portfolio. Inside were 3 things. The first was a stack of survey maps, hand-drawn, of the back 40 of the parcel, the slope above the cabin, the seasonal creek, the rock outcrop where the tetrahedrite vein came to the surface. They were drawn in her father's tight, precise hand, in pencil, on cotton vellum, with elevations marked to the half-foot and dates running along the bottom margin from 1972 to 2017. They were not the maps of an amateur. They were the maps of a man who had walked the same ground for 45 years and recorded what it told him. The second was a green canvas-bound notebook, the size of a hardback book, and on the cover in her father's hand was the single word Adelaide. The third was an envelope, white, sealed, her name on the front, Hollis Vance, in her father's hand. Beneath her name, in the same hand, smaller, 2 lines of pencil. Read in this order. Maps first. Adelaide second. Envelope last. Dad. She set the envelope aside. She set the notebook aside. She unfolded the topmost map. The vein ran 140 feet along the spine of the ridge. Her father had marked it in red pencil. Beside it, in the margin, in the same red pencil, in the hand of his last September, were 3 figures. The total ounces taken out of the vein from 1972 to 2017. The current spot price of silver as of September 14th, 2017. The product of the two. She did not gasp. She had spent 31 years reading numbers in conference rooms, and she did not gasp at numbers. She put the map down flat on the table, and she looked across the table at Cassius Birch, and she said, very quietly, how much of this is left in the ground? More than he took out, Cassius said. He worked it slow. He didn't want to draw attention. He never sold a 1/4 ounce inside the state of Idaho. He drove the metal to a refiner in Reno twice a year. He paid taxes on every pennyweight. The IRS has a clean record going back to 1973. The claim is paid up through 2027. The holding company is in your name and your brother's name in equal shares, but the operating control of the claim is in your name alone. He set that up in 2014. He told me he was setting it up because Dax had started asking questions about the parcel, and your father did not want Dax anywhere near the back 40. Dax doesn't know. Dax has never set foot on the back 40 in his life. Your father saw to that. He never showed it to him. He showed it to you once. You were 6. You don't remember. Cassius. Yes, ma'am. My brother has been trying to sell this cabin for 9 years. I know, ma'am. He has a buyer in Sandpoint. I know that too. The buyer is Wexler Lansdowne. He owns the gravel operation on Highway 2. He has been after this parcel since 1998. He came up here twice in the year your father died. The second time, your father met him at the gate with a rifle and told him the next time he set foot on the parcel, he would come off it on a tarp. Wexler Lansdowne never came back, but he has been talking to your brother since 2019. The fire shifted in the grate. Hollis Vance put her hand on the green notebook with her mother's name on the cover. She did not open it yet. She looked across the table at the man who had been keeping her father's house warm for 9 years against the day she would walk through the door, and she said the thing she had not yet been able to say to anyone, including herself. My mother did not drown. No, ma'am, Cassius Birch said. She did not. She read the maps first. She read them the way her father had taught her to read a topographic line, sitting at the kitchen table when she was 9 years old with a pencil in her hand and her elbows on the same pine boards she was sitting at now. She read them for 2 hours by the kerosene lamp Cassius had lit before he left, and she understood by the time she was done that her father had not been a man who happened to keep a small claim on a back ridge. Her father had been a man who had built a quiet, methodical operation across 45 years and had taught himself, alone, every skill it required, and had paid every tax it generated, and had told no one. Not his son, not his daughter, not the neighbors who had eaten at his table for half a century. He had told 2 people, his wife, and after his wife was gone, the man who had loved his wife as a sister and had loved Whitman Vance the way men of that country love their oldest friends, which is to say, without a single word ever spoken about the loving. Cassius had left at 9. He had said he would come back in the morning. He had said there were 2 more things she needed to see and that they would keep until daylight. She opened the green notebook at 10 past 10. Adelaide, the cover said. Inside, the first page was dated May 18th, 1979. 3 days after her mother had gone out alone on the river and not come back. I do not believe she drowned. I will not believe she drowned. I am writing this down because if I do not write it down, I will lose my mind, and I have 2 children to raise, and I cannot lose my mind. I will write down what I know. I will write down what I find. I will write down what I cannot prove. I will keep writing until I know. The notebook was 412 pages long. Her father had filled it across 38 years. Hollis read the first 30 pages straight through, and then she had to put it down because the room was tilting, and she stood up and went to the door and opened it and stood on the porch in the cold black September air and let the wind off the ridge come in her lungs until she could breathe again. Her mother had been killed. Her mother had been killed by a man named Hollister Crane, who had been the regional supervisor of the U.S. Geological Survey Field Office in Spokane in 1979, and who had been, for the last 18 months of her mother's life, embezzling federal hydrology grant money out of the office through a network of fabricated subcontractors. Adelaide Holcomb Vance had figured it out in March of 1979. She had told her husband about it in April. She had told her supervisor's supervisor in Boise the first week of May. She had been told an investigator would come up from Boise to take her statement on May 17th. She had gone out on the river alone on May 15th to do a routine flow measurement she had done 100 times. She had not come back. Hollister Crane had retired from the U.S. Geological Survey in November of 1979 with a clean record and a full pension. He had moved to Coeur d'Alene. He had died of a heart attack in 2003. He had never been investigated. The audit Adelaide had triggered had been quietly closed in August of 1979 by a man in the Boise office who had been Hollister Crane's college roommate. Whitman Vance had spent 38 years assembling the proof. He had not gone to the FBI. He had not gone to the press. He had not, for reasons the notebook explained on page 188 in 2 sentences her daughter would underline later with the same red pencil he had used on the maps, ever wanted his children to grow up in a town where their mother's name was in the newspaper attached to the word murder. He had wanted them to grow up. He had wanted them to leave. He had wanted them to come back to the cabin one day on their own time and learn what had happened on their own terms, in a room that smelled of cedar smoke and was warm, with a man at the kitchen table who had loved their mother and would tell them the truth without the cameras of strangers in the room. He had assembled, by the last entry in September of 2017, a complete file. Bank records, subpoenaed deposition transcripts from a parallel civil case. Hollister Crane had been a peripheral witness in 1991. A signed and notarized affidavit from a woman named Berenice Holcomb, Adelaide's younger sister, Hollis's aunt, a woman Hollis had met twice in her life, who had been on the phone with Adelaide on the evening of May 14, 1979, and had heard her sister say in a voice that had been steady but tired, "Barry, if anything happens to me on the river this week, it was not the river." Berenice Holcomb had carried that sentence for 35 years. She had given the affidavit to Whitman Vance in September of 2014. She had died of pancreatic cancer in February of 2015. The notebook ended on September 22, 2017, 3 weeks before her father died. The last entry was 4 lines. Hollis, Magnolia, is finishing medical school next year. You will lose the job inside of 5 years. You will come home then. I have left the proof in this notebook. I have left the silver in the ridge. I have left Cassius to keep the door warm. Do with all of it what your mother would have done. She closed the notebook at 3 in the morning. She did not open the envelope. She slept on a long pine bench in front of the fire with a Hudson Bay blanket over her, the way she had slept on it as a child when the snow came down hard and her father carried her in from the truck already half asleep and laid her down by the grate. She slept the way a person sleeps in a room that has been waiting for them for 40 years and has finally been entered. She did not dream. She woke at 6:15 with the cold gray light of the eastern ridge coming through the kitchen window, and the fire was out, and the cabin was cold, and she got up and laid the kindling the way her father had taught her, and she lit the fire again with 1 match, and she put the percolator on the stove, and she stood at the window and watched the light come up over the Selkirks, and she understood that she was not going back to Seattle. Cassius came at 7. He brought eggs from his hen house and a loaf of his wife's bread, and he did not ask her how the night had gone. He looked at her face, and he saw the answer he was looking for, and he set the eggs on the counter, and he said, "There's 2 things left." The first was the cash box. He pressed the 3rd stone again. He brought the box to the table. He set it down. He did not open it. He waited. Hollis lifted the lid herself. Inside was a stack of refiners' receipts, banded with rubber, going back to 1973. Beneath the receipts, a leather-bound bank passbook from a small private institution in Reno, Nevada. Beneath the passbook, a single sheet of paper from the Spokane lawyer her mother had gone to high school with, a man named Albright Peterson who, at 84, was still in practice 3 days a week, itemizing the current contents of the trust her father had funded across 45 years out of the silver receipts. Hollis read the figure at the bottom of the page once. She read it again. She did not read it a 3rd time. She set the paper down. She looked across the table at Cassius Birch, and she said, "He never spent any of it." "No, ma'am. He drove the same truck for 31 years. "Yes, ma'am. He wore the same coat." "Yes, ma'am. What was he saving it for?" Cassius did not answer. He looked at the envelope on the table, the white envelope, still sealed, with her name on the front in her father's hand, and he raised 1 finger toward it, and he said, "Open the last thing." She opened it. It was 1 page. "Hollis, the trust is for Magnolia and for whatever you decide to build with the rest of your life. The cabin is for you. The claim is for you. The notebook is for the truth. Do with it what your conscience tells you and not what anyone else tells you. Your brother is not a bad man. He is a frightened one. He will be very angry when he learns what has been here all along. He will say things he cannot take back. Forgive him if you can. Do not let him near the back 40. I love you. I have loved you every day of your life. I am sorry I was not the kind of father who could say it out loud. I am saying it now." Dad, she read it twice. She folded it. She put it in the breast pocket of her shirt, the pocket where her father had carried his small leather notebook for 41 years, and she stood up from the table and she said to Cassius Birch, "When does the buyer come?" "Wexler Lansdowne is meant to come up here on Saturday. Your brother told him last week the place would be empty. Your brother does not know you are here." "What day is today?" "Friday." "All right." She called her brother at 8:15. She did not tell him she was at the cabin. She told him she was driving up that morning with some news from the firm, and she would like him to meet her at the cabin at noon on Saturday, and she would like him to come alone. He said he could not get away. She said he could. He said why. She said because their father had left her something and she wanted to give him his half. He was quiet on the phone for a long count of 3. He said he would be there. He came at 12:10 on Saturday in his black SUV with his wife in the passenger seat. Hollis had asked him to come alone. He had not. Wexler Lansdowne came up the track behind him in a white Ford F-250 at 12:12. Cassius Birch was sitting on the porch in his green canvas coat with a mug of coffee in his hand. Albright Peterson, the lawyer from Spokane, was sitting beside him in a wool overcoat, 84 years old, with a leather satchel at his feet. A woman named Tamsin Auerbach, a wrongful death attorney out of Boise whom Peterson had called on Friday afternoon at Hollis's request, was sitting at the kitchen table inside the cabin with the green notebook and the cash box and the entire contents of the leather portfolio laid out in front of her in the order Whitman Vance had intended them to be read. Dax got out of the SUV. He saw Cassius on the porch. He saw the lawyer beside him. He saw Wexler Lansdowne's truck pulling in behind his own, and his face did the thing Hollis had been waiting 36 hours to watch it do, which was to register, in the small involuntary tightening at the corners of his mouth, that he had walked into a room he had not built. "Oh, Dax, what is this?" "This is the meeting you've been trying to have for 9 years. I wanted to make sure it happened with everyone in the same room." Wexler Lansdowne came up the path. He was 61 and broad-shouldered and wore an oilskin coat and the careful, neutral face of a man who had made his money by being the second person in a conversation to speak. He looked at Hollis. He looked at Cassius. He looked at the lawyer. He said, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." "There has not," Hollis said. "Mr. Lansdowne, my name is Hollis Vance. I am the operating controller of this parcel and the federal mining claim attached to it. The claim has been continuously worked and paid up since 1972. The parcel is not for sale. It has never been for sale. My brother does not have the authority to sell it and has not had that authority since 2014. I understand he has been in conversations with you since 2019. Those conversations are over today." Wexler Lansdowne looked at Dax. Dax did not look at Wexler Lansdowne. "Mining claim," Dax said. "Yes." "What mining claim?" "The one on the back 40. The one you have never walked. The one Dad filed in 1972. The one he worked alone for 45 years. The one that paid for Magnolia's medical school in a trust you were not told about because Dad did not trust you to leave it alone." Dax's wife got out of the passenger seat of the SUV. She stood by the open door. She did not come up the path. "Hollis." "Yes." "You don't get to." "I do, actually. The operating control was put in my name in September of 2014. Albright Peterson drew the papers. Dad signed them in his office in Spokane on the 18th of that month. Mr. Peterson has the originals in the satchel by his foot. The holding company is in both our names in equal shares for the surface parcel. The mineral claim, the trust, and the operating authority on the back 40 are mine alone. Dad did this on purpose. He did it because he did not want this place sold to a gravel operator and turned into a quarry. He did it because he knew you would try. He did it because he loved you and did not trust you. And a person could do both of those things at the same time, and ours did." Dax's mouth opened. It closed. It opened again. "Oh, there is one more thing, and you're going to want to sit down for this one." Mom did not drown. The light went out of his face. She watched it go. She had not been sure, walking out of the cabin that morning, whether she would say this part to him in front of Wexler Lansdowne or not. She had decided as she crossed the porch that she would. Not because Wexler Lansdowne deserved to hear it. Because Dax had spent 46 years not knowing, and the not knowing had made him into a man who tried to sell his father's land to a gravel operator, and she was not going to give him the gift of hearing about their mother in private after he had spent 9 years trying to take this place out from under her without telling her any of it. Forgiveness was on the road ahead. Forgiveness was not today. Dad spent 38 years assembling the proof, she said. It is in a notebook in that cabin. The notebook is going to a federal prosecutor in Boise on Monday morning. The man who did it is dead, but the men who covered it up are not all dead. There are going to be hearings. There are going to be questions. You're going to be asked some of them because you are her son. I'm going to be asked all of them because I am her daughter. I would like for you to stand beside me when those questions come, but I'm not going to ask you to. I'm going to leave that to you. Wexler Lansdowne cleared his throat. Mr. Lansdowne, Hollis said without looking at him. Get off my land. He got off her land. Dax did not. He stood at the foot of the slate path for a long time after Wexler Lansdowne's truck had gone back down the track, and his wife stood at the SUV, and Cassius and the lawyer sat on the porch and did not speak, and finally Dax sat down on the bottom porch step with his back to all of them, and he put his face in his hands, and he stayed there for the better part of an hour. When he stood up, his eyes were red and his voice was thin, and he said, I want to read the notebook. You can read it tonight. Whole. Yes. I am sorry. I know. I do not know about Mom. I know that too. I'm still going to be angry about the claim for a while. I expect you will be. All right. All right. He read the notebook that night at the kitchen table with the kerosene lamp on and a fresh pot of coffee on the stove. Hollis sat across from him and did not speak. He read until 2 in the morning. When he closed the notebook, he put both hands flat on the cover for a long count of 10, the way their father had put both hands on a thing when he was deciding what to feel about it. And then he stood up and walked outside and stood on the porch in the cold black September air and wept the way grown men weep when they are alone, which is to say without sound, with their hands on the porch rail, looking at the ridge. The federal prosecutor in Boise opened the file on Monday. The hearings began in February. 2 men retired from the U.S. Geological Survey under quiet pressure within a year. A third was indicted on obstruction charges related to the 1979 audit, the civil settlement against the estate of Hollister Crane and against the federal government. 8 years later, came in at a figure Hollis declined to disclose to the local paper that asked. The proceeds went into the trust, and the trust funded a hydrology fellowship at the University of Idaho in the name of Adelaide Holcomb Vance, which by the time Magnolia's daughter was old enough to apply for it, had sent 41 young women into the field her grandmother had been killed for. The cabin was not sold. The cabin was added to. Hollis built a small studio off the south porch in the spring of the second year, with a wall of windows facing the ridge, and she ran a quiet consulting practice out of it for the women's land trusts and the small mineral cooperatives of the Northern Rockies. And she made, in her first year alone in the studio, exactly 1/3 of what Sentinel Pacific Capital had been paying her to sit in glass-walled conference rooms in Seattle. It was enough. It was more than enough. Magnolia came up from Portland on weekends with her partner. Dax came up from Coeur d'Alene on Sundays. He came alone at first. By the 3rd year, he was bringing his wife. By the 5th year, he was bringing his grandchildren, and the grandchildren were learning to split kindling on the same stump where Hollis had learned to split it 48 years before. Cassius Birch came every Tuesday and every Saturday until he could not come anymore. And when he could not come anymore, Hollis drove down to his house on the river and sat with him and his wife and read to him out of John Muir. And when he passed in the spring of the 7th year, she carried his casket with 3 other men, and the 4th man was her brother. The plaque went up over the mantel in the great room the same year. It was small. It was brass. It said, Adelaide Holcomb Vance, 1942 to 1979. The mountains were calling. Below it, in smaller letters, Whitman Vance, 1938 to 2017. He waited until she was ready. The coffee on the stove every Tuesday morning, for as long as Hollis Vance lived in the cabin on the ridge above the Kootenai River, was always warm by 7 because somebody had banked the fire the night before, and somebody had laid the kindling at first light, and somebody had been keeping the door warm against the day. A tired daughter came up the track at the end of something, looking for the place she had been told was just a cabin, and finding instead, after 58 years of forgetting, the entire shape of who her people had been. Thank you for sitting with this story all the way to the end. The people who stay for the whole story are the ones who understand it. If it moved you, the videos on your screen right now are waiting to do the same. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come home. Left Behind has a story for you.